In the dense forests of upstate New York, 143 unmarked graves were discovered beneath the floorboards of an abandoned church. The local authorities were shocked to find that each skeleton bore signs of systematic torture. Fractured limbs that had healed before death, marks of repeated near-drowning, and strange carvings etched into their bones. For over 160 years, federal records about the Church of the Pure Spirit remain sealed, accessible only to those with special clearance. Documents that have never before been revealed to the public expose the horrifying truth behind the Ravencroft family's sinister legacy. 3 brothers, Elder Ezra, Deacon Silas, and Prophet Caleb Ravencroft, arrived in the quiet town of Ravenwood in 1825. They brought with them a new message of salvation, one rooted not in compassion, but in suffering. They convinced hundreds of devoted followers that physical pain was the only path to spiritual enlightenment. What began as a humble religious gathering quickly evolved into something far darker, something that would leave a stain on American history. The church they built was no ordinary place of worship. Its cold stone walls and featureless windows set the stage for rituals that would grow more disturbing with each passing year. The Ravencroft brothers used their charisma and authority to prey on the vulnerable, pushing them to endure unimaginable horrors in the name of purification. This is the terrifying story of how a small religious community turned into one of the most chilling and disturbing cults in American history. A tale of manipulation, death, and twisted faith. Welcome to the macabre history of the Ravencroft family. Ravenwood, a small town nestled in the dense forests of upstate New York, was a quiet and unremarkable place during the early 19th century. It was founded in 1803 by settlers who moved north from the Hudson Valley, seeking fertile land and fresh opportunities. Surrounded by rolling hills and thick woods, the town had a population of only about 300 people, who made their living primarily through farming, timber, and trade with nearby communities. Despite its peaceful exterior, Ravenwood found itself at the heart of a larger, sweeping religious movement that would leave its mark on American history. During this time, America was in the midst of a religious awakening. The early 19th century saw the rise of the Second Great Awakening, a period of intense evangelical fervor that spread across the United States. It was a time when traditional denominations such as the Episcopalians and Presbyterians were losing ground to newer, more passionate religious movements. Charismatic preachers drew huge crowds to outdoor revival meetings, where they delivered fiery sermons aimed at inspiring individuals to experience personal conversion and salvation. The entire country was, in many ways, in the midst of a spiritual upheaval. Upstate New York, particularly the region around Ravenwood, became known as the burned-over district, a place where the fervor of these religious movements was especially strong. The name was derived from the metaphor that the region had been burned over by so many religious revivals that the flames of spiritual fervor had left the area desolate, with every denomination and faith trying to stake its claim. The area became a breeding ground for new religious movements, some of which would later be considered cults. It was in this environment of spiritual confusion and fervor that the Ravencroft brothers arrived. The year was 1825, and the town of Ravenwood, with its mixture of skeptical, religiously weary settlers, seemed ripe for the brothers' message. They had heard of the religious unrest in the area and believed their teachings could offer the salvation that the spiritually lost residents of the burned-over district were searching for. The brothers, Elder Ezra, Deacon Silas, and Prophet Caleb, arrived in the small town with a clear, if ominous, mission: to establish a new form of worship, one that would purify the soul through physical suffering. The brothers were not the first to bring a new faith to the region, nor would they be the last. But their message, which promised divine salvation through pain and tribulation, set them apart from others. The brothers had a commanding presence, each one carrying a unique set of qualities that made them both compelling and dangerous. Elder Ezra, the eldest of the 3, was 42 years old at the time of their arrival. He had the demeanor of a man who was accustomed to authority, and his piercing eyes seemed to peer directly into the soul of anyone he spoke to. His speeches were authoritative and filled with fire, which drew in the more vulnerable members of the community. Deacon Silas, 39 years old, was the intellectual of the trio. He carried a set of wire-rimmed spectacles and was often seen with ink-stained fingers, as he wrote continuously, composing the sacred texts that would later become the foundation of their doctrine. His scholarly nature lent an air of legitimacy to their teachings, making them seem more grounded in intellectual and theological reasoning than the fire and brimstone sermons delivered by some of their contemporaries. Lastly, there was Prophet Caleb, the youngest at 35. Caleb possessed an unsettling charm, the type that attracted as many followers as it alienated. His pale blue eyes would roll back during what he claimed were divine visions, and his whispers carried an unsettling authority that seemed to draw people in, even as it disturbed them. The brothers purchased a large plot of land on the outskirts of Ravenwood, far enough from the town center to maintain a sense of isolation, but close enough to gain access to the resources they would need to build their new church. They called it the Church of the Pure Spirit. The church was unlike anything the town had seen before. While other churches in the area were simple white structures made of wood, the Ravencrofts built theirs out of dark, imposing stone quarried from the nearby hills. Its architecture was also strange. The church had a central octagonal sanctuary surrounded by 8 smaller chambers, and its steeple rose far higher than any building in the area seemed to warrant. Most unnerving of all, however, was the lack of windows in the main sanctuary. Light was provided only by carefully positioned lanterns, casting eerie shadows on the walls as the brothers led their services. This absence of natural light seemed to set the stage for something darker, a place where suffering could be hidden, unobserved, and sanctified. Ezra, standing before the town's curious first visitors, boldly declared, "We have been called by the Spirit to this place. In an age of false prophets, we bring the true message of purification through tribulation." It was a message that would resonate deeply with some of the townspeople and draw them in, just as the Ravencrofts had hoped. Ravenwood would never be the same again. In the summer of 1825, the small town of Ravenwood experienced a change that would forever alter its course. The Ravencroft brothers, Elder Ezra, Deacon Silas, and Prophet Caleb, arrived in town with a clear purpose. Though they were strangers to the community, their mission was anything but subtle. The brothers were not content to merely be newcomers seeking a quiet life. They were determined to transform Ravenwood into the cradle of a new religious understanding. Elder Ezra, the eldest and most authoritative of the three, carried himself with a commanding presence that made others feel both awed and uncomfortable. At 42, he had the appearance of a man who was used to leading others. His dark, piercing eyes seemed to look through people, as if he could see their deepest fears and desires with just a glance. Ezra was a man of strong convictions, and his speeches were designed to command obedience. When he spoke, there was a certainty in his voice that made people believe that he was a vessel for divine knowledge. His ability to draw people in, especially the weak and desperate, was unmatched. Deacon Silas, 39 years old, had a quieter, more scholarly air about him. With wire-rimmed spectacles perched on the bridge of his nose and ink stains perpetually marking his slender fingers, he appeared to be the intellectual of the group. Unlike Ezra's commanding demeanor, Silas was calm and measured in his approach, speaking with the authority of someone who had carefully thought through every word. He spent his time writing religious texts, developing the doctrines that would underpin the church's teachings. His role was essential, as he provided the theological framework that Ezra and Caleb used to persuade their followers. The youngest brother, Prophet Caleb, 35, was a figure of both fascination and fear. His unsettling charisma was undeniable. Caleb's pale blue eyes, often rolled back in what appeared to be divine visions, added to his mystique. His whispers could be heard across crowded rooms, and despite his soft-spoken nature, there was an undeniable power in his words. Caleb spoke of things not of this world, claiming to receive visions from the Spirit that guided his every action. His followers would come to believe that Caleb was not just a prophet, but a conduit for a higher power, chosen to bring salvation through suffering. Upon their arrival, the brothers wasted no time establishing their influence. They purchased a large tract of land on the outskirts of town, a place secluded enough to allow for privacy, but accessible enough for potential converts. Soon, they began construction of a church that would become the focal point of their new movement. Unlike the simple wooden meeting houses common to New England, the church was built from dark stone, with an architecture that was both imposing and unusual. Its design seemed to reflect the nature of the brothers' teachings, an austere, almost forbidding structure that exuded mystery and control. At their first public gathering, Elder Ezra addressed the small crowd of curious locals. "We have been called by the Spirit to this place," he proclaimed. "In an age of false prophets, we bring the true message of purification through tribulation." It was a message that would resonate with the vulnerable souls of Ravenwood, who were looking for something more meaningful in a time of spiritual confusion. The Church of the Pure Spirit was unlike any place of worship the people of Ravenwood had ever encountered. Built by the Ravencroft brothers on the outskirts of town, the church's imposing, dark stone walls immediately set it apart from the simple wooden meeting houses common in the area. As they constructed it, the brothers created a structure that was not just a physical building, but a symbol of their twisted doctrine, a place where suffering and purity would be intimately linked. The church's design was as unusual as the message it preached. At the center of the building stood an octagonal sanctuary, surrounded by 8 smaller chambers, each one serving a specific purpose in the brothers' rituals. The structure was vast, its stone walls cold and unwelcoming. Most striking of all was the absence of windows in the main sanctuary. There was no natural light to soften the bleakness of the space. Instead, the church was illuminated only by carefully placed lanterns that cast eerie, flickering shadows on the stone floor. This lack of light added an element of dread to the proceedings, a feeling that something sinister was always lurking just beyond sight. From the very beginning, the brothers made it clear that this church was not a place for the faint-hearted. Elder Ezra's first public sermon was both compelling and unsettling. He spoke of purification through suffering, claiming that the soul could only be saved by enduring physical pain. "The flesh is the vessel of sin," he would often say. "Only when it has been tested, tried, and broken can the spirit truly soar." His words, though frightening to some, were strangely comforting to those who felt disconnected from their traditional religious practices. To the troubled and the desperate, it seemed like a way to find meaning through their pain. While the church's teachings initially focused on voluntary fasting, prayer vigils, and mild physical discomfort, the brothers soon introduced a series of purification rituals. These early ceremonies, though shocking, were still mild compared to the horrors that would follow. But the stage was set. The church was gaining influence, and its followers were becoming more devout, willing to accept whatever the brothers told them. The Church of the Pure Spirit was becoming more than just a place of worship. It was the heart of a growing cult, one that would soon embrace far darker practices in the name of salvation. As the Church of the Pure Spirit began to take shape, so too did the cult that would revolve around it. The Ravencroft brothers' message of purification through suffering resonated deeply with the people of Ravenwood, and slowly, the town's population started to swell with new converts. The brothers were careful in choosing who could join their community. They were selective, wanting only the purest individuals who could endure the physical and mental tribulations that their faith demanded. The majority of their early followers were individuals who were lost, broken, or seeking meaning in a time of spiritual confusion. The economically desperate were drawn in by promises of a stronger community, while the emotionally broken sought solace in the belief that their suffering had a greater purpose. The wealthier townsfolk, too, were intrigued by the idea of spiritual elevation through hardship. It was a new and exciting concept, one that promised an experience beyond the hollow rituals of traditional denominations. Soon, the brothers' influence spread beyond Ravenwood. News of their teachings began to attract followers from nearby towns and villages, many of whom traveled great distances to hear Elder Ezra speak. The Church of the Pure Spirit was no longer just a local curiosity. It was becoming a movement, one that was gaining traction in a region already steeped in religious fervor. To maintain control over their growing congregation, the brothers began to implement more structured rituals. Initially, the teachings were focused on asceticism, fasting, prayer vigils, and symbolic acts of self-denial. These practices, while harsh, were still within the realm of what some might consider a legitimate form of spiritual discipline. However, as their following grew, the rituals began to escalate. What had begun as a series of voluntary acts of penance soon became mandatory, and those who refused to participate found themselves ostracized from the community. The Ravencrofts began to demand that their followers endure increasingly difficult forms of purification, pushing them further into isolation from the rest of society. One of the brothers' most disturbing practices was their discernment process, an interview conducted by Prophet Caleb to determine if potential converts were worthy of joining the church. Caleb's ability to manipulate people's emotions and convince them that their suffering had divine meaning became an integral part of the cult's appeal. Those deemed worthy were welcomed into the fold, but the cost of belonging was steep. Followers were expected to donate their property, their savings, and sometimes even their loved ones, in exchange for the promise of spiritual salvation. The brothers presented their growing community as a utopian society, free from the distractions and vices of the outside world. Those who joined were required to give up worldly possessions, sever ties with family members, and embrace the radical new doctrines of the Ravencrofts. Over time, the followers were encouraged to live on the church compound, building their lives around the church's core teachings. While some maintained homes in Ravenwood, they spent most of their time at the compound, fully immersing themselves in the increasingly extreme practices the Ravencrofts preached. As the number of converts continued to climb, so did the Ravencroft brothers' power. They were no longer just preachers of a new faith. They had become leaders of a growing cult, one whose practices would soon become far darker and more sinister than anyone could have imagined. As the Church of the Pure Spirit continued to grow, so did the intensity and extremity of the rituals practiced by its followers. What had started as a form of mild penance, fasting, prayer vigils, and symbolic acts of self-denial, soon evolved into something far darker. The Ravencroft brothers, particularly Elder Ezra and Prophet Caleb, began to introduce new purification rituals that pushed their followers to the edge of endurance. These practices were no longer voluntary. They were mandatory, and those who hesitated or refused were quickly cast out from the community. Elder Ezra believed that suffering was the only true path to salvation. He often preached about the nature of the flesh, claiming that the body was the vessel of sin, and only through pain could the soul be cleansed. The flesh must be broken, he would declare, so that the spirit can rise and be made pure. These words resonated deeply with many of the church's followers, who had come seeking redemption for their broken lives. However, as the rituals became more extreme, the line between purification and torture began to blur. The first of the more intense rituals was known as the trial of the body. It was presented as a test of one's commitment to the faith. Each participant was blindfolded and stripped of their clothing, then subjected to a series of physically demanding tasks designed to weaken them both mentally and physically. The tasks varied, but they were always grueling. Long hours of fasting, forced isolation, and painful exercises meant to break the body's resistance. The trial of the body was not just a test of physical endurance but a mental battle as well, as the participants were encouraged to focus their thoughts on spiritual purity while enduring unimaginable discomfort. While many followers viewed this trial as a necessary step towards enlightenment, it was clear that the Ravencrofts had crossed a line. What began as a voluntary, symbolic form of penance had transformed into a sadistic physical ordeal. The trial of the body was just the beginning. Soon after, the brothers introduced the trial of the spirit, a ritual even more disturbing than the first. The followers were led to a dark, isolated chamber within the church compound, where they were told they would face their deepest fears and insecurities. Blindfolded again, each participant was subjected to various forms of psychological manipulation. They were fed lies about their own worth, told that they were worthless and doomed unless they proved their devotion through extreme physical acts. The brothers would whisper in their ears, convincing them that they had to endure the pain to purify themselves. Prophet Caleb, who had a particularly unsettling charisma, took on a larger role in these rituals. He would often claim to receive divine visions during the trials, using these so-called visions to manipulate his followers further. He would speak of divine punishment and redemption, convincing the participants that they were chosen to suffer for the greater good. In Caleb's hands, pain became a form of spiritual communication, a way to communicate with the divine. As the weeks passed, the rituals became more intense. The boundaries between devotion and madness began to blur. What had been pitched as a form of spiritual cleansing was now becoming a ritualized form of abuse. But for many, the brothers' authority was unquestionable. The followers, having given up so much already, families, wealth, and freedom, could not stop now. They had given themselves to the faith, and now they were willing to do anything to prove their devotion. In the summer of 1830, the Ravencroft brothers introduced what they called the First Ascension. This was to be the pinnacle of their religious practices, the moment when their followers would truly prove their devotion. It was the ritual that would transform the cult from a strange religious sect into something far darker. A group willing to sacrifice everything, including their very lives, for the promise of salvation. What began as a mysterious act of purification quickly escalated into something more horrifying, marking the point at which the Ravencroft brothers fully embraced their descent into fanaticism. The First Ascension was unlike anything the community had ever seen. The brothers framed it as an opportunity for their followers to transcend their earthly suffering and enter a higher realm of spiritual purity. It was to be a one-time, sacred event, performed only by the most devout members of the congregation. Those who were chosen were required to undergo intense physical and mental preparation, enduring days of fasting and prayer to cleanse their bodies and minds of worldly distractions. By the time the First Ascension was to take place, the participants were weak, dehydrated, and spiritually vulnerable. The ritual itself was held deep within the bowels of the church, in a secret chamber that had been specially designed for the event. The walls were adorned with unsettling symbols, and the air inside was thick with the scent of incense and candle wax. The participants, stripped of their clothes and blindfolded, were led into the chamber one by one, their bodies trembling with a mixture of fear and anticipation. Elder Ezra stood at the center of the room, his dark eyes gleaming with authority. He spoke in a low, resonant voice, calling upon the spirits to descend upon the followers and elevate them to a higher plane. Through suffering, he intoned, you will be purified. Through pain, your spirits will soar. The followers stood in a circle around him, awaiting the moment when they would prove their worthiness through the ultimate act of devotion. The First Ascension was a grotesque combination of physical endurance and psychological manipulation. The chosen followers were subjected to extreme forms of torture. They were whipped, burned, and forced to endure excruciating physical positions for hours on end. As the ritual intensified, Caleb, the prophet, moved among them, whispering what he claimed were divine instructions, urging them to endure and to embrace their suffering as a path to eternal life. What was meant to be a spiritual trial quickly crossed the line into something far more sinister. The brothers had designed the ritual not just as a test of faith, but as a means of breaking the bodies and minds of their followers, pushing them to the brink of death. One by one, the participants collapsed, unable to continue. Some screamed in agony, while others fell silent, their bodies racked with pain. Despite the agony, they were told that their suffering was the only way to achieve redemption. By the end of the First Ascension, several followers had died, their bodies left behind in the blood-stained chamber. The surviving members of the cult were left in a dazed state, broken physically and spiritually. The brothers declared the ritual a success, convincing their followers that the deaths were part of the divine plan. They had ascended to a higher plane, leaving behind their mortal bodies. The First Ascension marked the point at which the Ravencroft brothers' religious practices ceased to be merely disturbing and became outright dangerous. The cult was now on a path of irreversible corruption. The aftermath of the First Ascension was both immediate and profound. Though the Ravencroft brothers claimed the ritual was a success, its consequences were far more severe than they had anticipated. The survivors of the ritual were physically and mentally broken, their bodies scarred from the abuse they had endured, and their minds shattered by the horrific experience. Yet, despite the trauma, the brothers continued to preach that their suffering was divinely ordained, necessary for their spiritual growth. In the days following the First Ascension, the once proud community of the Church of the Pure Spirit began to fracture. Some of the followers, unable to cope with the horrors they had witnessed and experienced, began to question the brothers' teachings. They quietly left the compound, slipping away in the dead of night, fearful of the repercussions of their departure. Yet the Ravencrofts did not show any signs of mercy toward those who questioned or left the faith. They were swiftly labeled as unworthy and were ostracized from the community. The growing dissent was met with increasing authoritarian measures by the brothers. Elder Ezra's speeches became more frantic, and he began to reinforce the idea that those who questioned the church were agents of evil. His sermons were filled with warnings about the dangers of outside influences, and the brothers started to increase their control over the lives of their followers. The cult began to resemble a closed, insular society, with little contact allowed between members and the outside world. The Ravencrofts demanded complete loyalty, threatening dire consequences for anyone who dared to question their authority. But the deaths and suffering that accompanied the First Ascension were too much for many to ignore. The surviving followers began to experience severe physical and psychological effects. Many of the women who had participated in the ritual were found to be incapable of bearing children due to the intense physical trauma, while the men suffered from permanent disabilities caused by the beatings and burns they had endured. The psychological toll was no less severe. Many followers became increasingly paranoid, believing that the spirit of the Ravencroft brothers resided in them and that they were now chosen to endure eternal suffering for the greater good. Despite the mounting consequences, the brothers continued to manipulate their followers, assuring them that only through further sacrifice could they earn the ultimate redemption. As the years passed, the eerie practices of the Ravencroft brothers began to attract suspicion, but it wasn't until a series of strange events unfolded that the truth about the Church of the Pure Spirit began to unravel. The surviving members, still devoted to the brothers' teachings, remained silent about the horrors they had endured, but whispers of the ritual deaths and the growing number of disappearances soon reached the ears of outsiders. In 1835, a former follower of the church, a young woman named Lydia Parker, came forward with a harrowing account of what she had witnessed during her time at the compound. Lydia had left the cult after the First Ascension, and her testimony would become the catalyst that sparked an official investigation. She spoke of the brutal rituals, the deaths that followed, and the psychological manipulation used by the Ravencroft brothers to maintain control over their followers. Lydia's claims were shocking, and as more survivors came forward, the authorities were forced to take action. A federal investigation was launched, and soon, agents were dispatched to Ravenwood to look into the growing rumors surrounding the church. The government, still reeling from the revelations of other cults in the area, saw the Ravencrofts as a dangerous threat to both public safety and religious integrity. The investigation unearthed a wealth of chilling information. Federal agents discovered a series of hidden documents detailing the brothers' twisted belief system, which had been passed down through their secret teachings. These documents included journals written by Deacon Silas, which outlined the brothers' intentions to create a new world order based on the principles of pain and suffering. It became clear that the Ravencrofts saw themselves not just as religious leaders but as architects of a new, more pure society, one built on control, fear, and manipulation. In addition to the documents, the agents uncovered the remains of several bodies hidden in the church's catacombs, bodies that had been subjected to the same brutal rituals that had left so many survivors permanently scarred. The discovery of these remains, coupled with testimonies from former followers, left little doubt about the true nature of the Ravencroft brothers' actions. The mystery of the Church of the Pure Spirit was now fully exposed, but the Ravencrofts were nowhere to be found. The brothers had vanished, leaving only the horrifying legacy of their twisted faith behind. The revelation of the Church of the Pure Spirit's twisted practices sent shockwaves throughout the region. What had once been a quiet, secluded cult was now the center of a federal investigation, and authorities were determined to bring justice to those who had suffered under the control of the Ravencroft brothers. The disappearance of the brothers only heightened the mystery, but the survivors and their testimonies were key in uncovering the full extent of the horrors that had taken place at the church. Federal agents, along with local law enforcement, began scouring the remains of the church compound for any clues that could lead them to the brothers. The church, once a place of worship, was now a grim, blood-stained reminder of the control the Ravencrofts had over their followers. The agents discovered hidden chambers beneath the main sanctuary, rooms that had been used for the most brutal of the rituals. These chambers were equipped with restraints, hooks, and implements of torture, all designed to break the will of those who were subjected to them. Testimonies from former followers were critical in piecing together the final moments of the Ravencroft cult. Many survivors spoke of the psychological tactics used by Prophet Caleb, whose visions convinced followers that their suffering was an act of divine will. Others described Elder Ezra's commanding presence, how he would stand before them and demand complete obedience, making them feel as if they had no choice but to comply. These testimonies were heart-wrenching, as many survivors recounted their personal losses, friends and family members who had been driven to their deaths in the name of purification. The investigation revealed that the Ravencrofts had used their teachings to isolate their followers from the outside world, manipulating them into believing that their suffering would bring them closer to God. The survivors spoke of the complete emotional and physical control the brothers had over them, and how they were made to feel guilty for even questioning the brothers' motives. Despite the mounting evidence and survivor accounts, the Ravencrofts remained elusive. The brothers had disappeared without a trace, leaving behind only the wreckage of their cult. The final investigation would never uncover their fate, but it did provide some measure of justice for the victims. The federal government seized the church's land, and the remaining followers were given assistance to help them rebuild their shattered lives. Though the Ravencrofts were never found, their legacy of terror would linger in the minds of those who had survived. The Ravencroft brothers' ability to manipulate and control their followers was perhaps their most dangerous weapon. While physical torture and suffering were a constant part of the Church of the Pure Spirit's rituals, it was their psychological control that kept the cult functioning, ensuring that their followers remained loyal, even after enduring unimaginable pain. This manipulation was subtle, insidious, and incredibly effective, making it impossible for many of the cult members to see the horrors they were living through until it was too late. At the heart of the psychological control was the power of guilt and fear. Elder Ezra, the charismatic leader, would often preach about the impurity of the flesh and the necessity of cleansing the soul through suffering. But the psychological aspect of his message was far more complex. Ezra didn't just preach suffering. He made the followers believe that if they failed to endure pain or if they questioned the rituals, they were condemning themselves to eternal damnation. This fear of hell, of an eternity spent in torment, was instilled so deeply in the minds of the followers that many willingly accepted the torture they were subjected to. The brothers didn't need to force the followers to undergo the rituals. They only needed to convince them that it was their duty to do so to save their souls. Caleb, the youngest and most manipulative of the brothers, played an equally important role in maintaining psychological control. His divine visions were a powerful tool in convincing the followers that the brothers were not just religious leaders, but actual conduits of a higher power. Caleb's ability to deliver messages from the Spirit convinced his followers that they were part of something far greater than themselves, and the idea of being chosen for this divine purpose kept them bound to the cult. Caleb's visions were vague and cryptic, but they resonated deeply with the followers, giving them a false sense of purpose and meaning. He had an unsettling ability to make them believe that their suffering was not only justified but necessary for their spiritual evolution. Another critical element in the brothers' psychological manipulation was the constant isolation of their followers. The Ravencrofts were quick to sever their followers' ties with the outside world. The church compound was intentionally built far from the town center, creating a physical separation between the cult and the larger society. As the cult grew, the brothers discouraged any form of contact with family, friends, or anyone outside the church. They convinced their followers that the outside world was filled with temptations and dangers, and that only within the church could they achieve true salvation. This isolation made the followers more dependent on the brothers and further ensured that their reality was shaped entirely by the teachings of the Ravencrofts. The final piece of their psychological strategy was the control of self-worth. The brothers often told their followers that they were worthless without their teachings, that they were sinful and unworthy of salvation unless they submitted entirely to the cult. Those who began to question the doctrine or express doubts were immediately shamed. The Ravencrofts would use guilt as a weapon, making them feel as though they were not only betraying the church but also condemning their souls to eternal suffering. This constant undermining of self-worth made it nearly impossible for any follower to leave the cult without feeling immense shame and fear of spiritual damnation. In the end, the psychological control the Ravencrofts exerted over their followers was the true source of their power. They didn't just manipulate bodies, they manipulated minds, turning their followers into willing instruments of their own suffering. As the investigation into the Ravencroft brothers' activities continued, the true extent of the horrors they had orchestrated began to emerge. The church compound, once thought to be a place of religious devotion, was now revealed as the site of unimaginable atrocities. What had appeared to be an ordinary place of worship was, in fact, a chamber of horrors, a place where the boundaries between faith and sadism had been completely obliterated. It was here, in the dark, secret chambers beneath the church, that the full scope of the brothers' cruel practices was uncovered. Federal agents, guided by the testimonies of survivors, began to search the catacombs beneath the church. The catacombs had been sealed for years, but once they were opened, they revealed the true nature of the cult's depravity. Inside these underground chambers, investigators discovered walls lined with strange symbols that had been drawn hastily and in blood. The walls themselves were pockmarked with marks of torture, signs of the suffering that had taken place within these stone confines. These were not just religious symbols. They were the markings of a mind twisted by power and control. In one chamber, agents uncovered a collection of items that would haunt them for the rest of their careers. A collection of preserved human remains, arranged in disturbing patterns, was discovered. These were not the bodies of the cult's victims, but rather the remains of those who had been subjected to the brothers' sadistic rituals. Some of the bones had been etched with runes, others had been burned, and still more had been meticulously arranged in ways that suggested they had been used for ceremonial purposes. These remains were a grim testament to the lengths the Ravencrofts had gone to in their quest for power and control. The most chilling discovery was made in a small, dark room at the heart of the catacombs. It was here that the brothers had carried out the most grotesque of their rituals. In this room, a stone altar stood at the center, stained with the blood of those who had been sacrificed. The altar was surrounded by chains, shackles, and implements designed to cause pain and suffering. The remains of several victims were found, each one positioned in a manner that suggested they had been tortured before their death. The horror of these discoveries was compounded by the realization that these were not isolated incidents, but rather part of a long-standing pattern of abuse. The survivors, many of whom had been deeply traumatized by their experiences, provided key information that helped authorities piece together the full extent of the brothers' crimes. They spoke of the rituals, the beatings, and the psychological torment they had endured at the hands of the Ravencrofts. They described how the brothers had convinced them that their suffering was a necessary step in achieving spiritual purity. The survivors' testimony was chilling, and it painted a picture of a cult that had been built on fear, manipulation, and sadistic cruelty. As the investigation continued, it became clear that the Ravencrofts had not only preyed upon the vulnerable, but had also exploited the very nature of faith itself. They had perverted religious doctrine, turning it into a tool for control and suffering. What had begun as a seemingly innocent message of salvation through suffering had become a nightmare of unimaginable proportions. The aftermath of the Ravencroft brothers' reign of terror was felt far beyond the confines of Ravenwood. Though the brothers had disappeared without a trace, their twisted legacy lived on in the survivors and the wreckage they left behind. The investigation had uncovered the full extent of the brothers' cruelty, but the emotional and psychological scars they left on their followers would endure for years to come. The immediate fallout was swift. The federal government seized the church's land and assets, dismantling the remaining parts of the compound. The survivors, many of whom had endured years of physical and emotional torment, were given the assistance they desperately needed to rebuild their lives. But for many, the road to recovery was long and filled with pain. The psychological scars left by the Ravencroft brothers' manipulations were profound. Some survivors struggled to come to terms with their actions during their time in the cult, unable to shake the feeling of guilt that had been instilled in them. Others were left with permanent physical injuries from the brutal rituals, injuries that would never fully heal. The town of Ravenwood, once a quiet and peaceful community, was left in shock. The discovery of the cult's activities tarnished the town's reputation and left its residents grappling with the fact that their neighbors had been involved in such unspeakable acts. Many had seen the Ravencroft brothers as simply another religious group, not realizing the true extent of their influence until it was too late. The town struggled to reconcile with the horrors that had unfolded in their midst, and many residents sought to distance themselves from the tragedy. The legacy of the Ravencrofts was not limited to the immediate survivors or the town of Ravenwood. The case became a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked power and the manipulation of vulnerable individuals under the guise of religion. The investigation into the Ravencroft family was widely publicized, and it served as a warning to other religious communities about the potential for abuse within isolated and authoritarian systems. The case highlighted the vulnerability of those seeking solace and purpose in times of spiritual confusion, and it raised important questions about the responsibility of religious leaders and the dangers of blind faith. Despite the public outcry and the eventual collapse of the church, the Ravencroft brothers' influence lingered. A small but dedicated group of followers continued to believe in their teachings, refusing to accept the revelations of the cult's true nature. These remaining adherents, though a minority, kept the memory of the brothers alive, passing down their twisted interpretations of faith to new generations. The Ravencrofts may have disappeared physically, but their impact on the lives they touched would never fade. The survivors, while rebuilding their lives, often spoke of the emotional toll that their time in the cult had taken on them. They struggled with the question of how they had been manipulated so completely, and many spent years seeking to understand the psychological techniques that had been used to control them. Some survivors found solace in speaking out, sharing their stories with the world in the hope that their experiences could help others avoid falling prey to similar schemes. The story of the Ravencroft brothers serves as a chilling reminder of the dangers of unchecked power, the vulnerability of the human spirit, and the dark potential that lies within the manipulation of faith. The cult that they built, based on the twisted idea of purification through suffering, was not just a place of spiritual deception. It was a prison of the mind and body. The horrors uncovered at the Church of the Pure Spirit revealed the depths of human cruelty, as the brothers used their influence to push their followers into unimaginable pain and suffering. As we reflect on the Ravencroft brothers' legacy, it is important to remember the human cost of their actions. The survivors, though freed from the physical bonds of the cult, would forever carry the scars of their experiences. Many struggled with feelings of guilt, shame, and confusion, emotions that had been deliberately instilled in them by the brothers. Their journey toward healing was long and difficult, but in their stories lies a powerful message of resilience and recovery. Their courage to speak out and share their experiences helped expose the horrors of the cult and brought attention to the dangers of manipulation, control, and emotional abuse disguised as spiritual guidance. The broader impact of the Ravencroft case extended far beyond Ravenwood. The investigation raised awareness about the potential for religious abuse within isolated, authoritarian communities, and it became a warning to society about the need for vigilance in the face of manipulative and controlling leaders. The government's intervention, though necessary, could not undo the harm done to those who had been caught in the grip of the Ravencroft's power. It was a stark reminder of the human cost of blind faith and the lengths to which some would go to exploit the vulnerable. While the Ravencroft brothers were never found, their influence continued to reverberate in the years that followed. The survivors and the families of the victims would forever be haunted by the memories of what had occurred at the church, and the echoes of the brothers' teachings still lingered in some corners of the world. A small group of diehard followers refused to accept the truth, continuing to spread the perverted teachings of the brothers and believing that their work had been divinely inspired. But for the majority, the fall of the Ravencroft cult was a warning, a grim reminder of the dangers of religious extremism and the power of psychological manipulation. In the end, the Ravencrofts may have vanished from the world, but the lessons of their story remain. Faith is a powerful thing, and when it is used to control, it can become a weapon of mass destruction. The legacy of the Ravencroft brothers is a testament to the importance of critical thinking, skepticism, and the need for society to protect its most vulnerable from those who would exploit them in the name of religion. As we've seen through the harrowing tale of the Ravencroft family, The consequences of blind devotion and unchecked authority can be devastating. The story is a reminder of how easily manipulation can take root, especially when those in power exploit the vulnerabilities of others. It's a chilling example of how one man's influence can twist an entire community and leave behind scars that last a lifetime. But this isn't just a story of horror, it's a call to action. It serves as a warning to us all, to be vigilant in our understanding of the world around us, to question authority, and to be skeptical of those who claim to hold the only path to truth. It's essential that we protect those who are most vulnerable to such manipulation, offering them the support, resources, and understanding they need to break free from the chains of false prophets. If this story resonates with you, consider sharing it. Let others know that such things can happen anywhere to anyone, and that we must remain aware of the psychological tactics used by manipulative individuals. Help spread awareness of the dangers of cults, psychological abuse, and the importance of mental and emotional well-being. We encourage you to engage with us. Comment below with your thoughts, share your experiences, and contribute to the conversation. Let's come together to build a community that values transparency, awareness, and healing. And remember, if you or someone you know is struggling with the aftereffects of such experiences, you are not alone. There are resources available to help you reclaim your life and restore your peace. Stay vigilant, stay informed, and always question what you're being told. Together, we can ensure that history doesn't repeat itself.